It's the Thanksgiving holiday, and I'll go with something light. And with that, I present you with the first episode of Diversion. With these Diversion episodes, I'll share stories and anecdotes from my decades in the airline industry. My hope is that you find these entertaining and that they complement the consumer-focused episodes. Enjoy! On a popular online community, someone asked if commercial airlines transport prisoners. They said that they'd recently been on a flight that was about 40% full. There were 3 men that were seated together in the last row of the plane. It was noteworthy because there was a bunch of empty seats around them. The commenter said that they didn't understand why the men didn't spread out to other rows for extra space. During the flight, the commenter made a trip to the bathroom, back to the rear lavatory. As they walked past the last row, they saw that the man in the middle seat was in handcuffs. In this episode, I'll talk about prisoners and wrap up with an interesting experience I had while checking in a prisoner and his escorts. It's a story I've told a few times and something I'll remember for the rest of my life. So, what's the story with prisoners on planes? What's going on there? The answer is yes, prisoners are occasionally transported on regular commercial flights. Let's start with the general background. Prisoners are moved around the country for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm not familiar with. Typically, corrections departments use ground transportation to move prisoners around. That could be buses, vans, or automobiles that are dedicated to inmate transportation. Thanks to Hollywood, people already know about Con Air, which is another way of moving inmates back and forth. It's currently late November 2024. This is the first paragraph about Con Air on their Wikipedia page, which I'll read out loud. The Justice, Prisoner, and Alien Transportation System, JPATS, also nicknamed Con Air, is the United States Marshal Service airline charged with transportation of prisoners in legal custody between prisons, detention centers, courthouses, and other locations. It is the largest prisoner transport network in the world. USA, USA. I'm kidding. Though primarily used by the Federal Bureau of Prisons or U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, JPATS also assists military and state law enforcement. With all due respect to Nicolas Cage, we're not focusing on Con Air today. Instead, we'll talk about the prisoners and the armed law enforcement officers escorting them on commercial flights. Low-risk prisoners that are transported on a commercial flight are escorted by 1 or 2 law enforcement officers that are armed during the flight. High-risk prisoners are accompanied by at least 2 law enforcement officers that are armed. The law enforcement officers must advise the airline if their agency considers the prisoner to be high risk or low risk. The federal regulation says that high-risk prisoner means a prisoner who is an exceptional escape risk, as determined by the law enforcement agency, and charged with or convicted of a violent crime. Low-risk prisoner means any prisoner who has not been designated as high risk. Officers are responsible for searching the prisoner for anything that could be used as a weapon, and they must assure the airline that they are safe for transport. Officers must accompany the prisoner at all times and keep the prisoner under control while aboard the aircraft. Normally, the law enforcement officer and the prisoner are boarded first and are the last to get off the plane when they arrive at the destination. They are typically seated in the last row of the aircraft, and the law enforcement officer must be seated between the prisoner and any aisle. The prisoners are not allowed to consume alcoholic beverages and, in fact, are only allowed to eat or drink with the approval of their law enforcement escorts. If they are allowed to eat, then they're not allowed to use metal utensils. Shocker, right? The law enforcement officers must ensure that the prisoner is restrained from full use of their hands by an appropriate device that provides for minimum movement. That's a long-winded way of saying handcuffs. So that is what the Delta passenger saw, a prisoner in handcuffs being transported somewhere. Back in the 1990s, when I was a ticket agent at the airport, I did check in a few law enforcement officers and prisoners. and I saw times when a waist chain was used along with the handcuffs. The law enforcement officers allowed the prisoners to use a jacket or their clothing to cover up the handcuffs. Both parties prefer not to draw the attention of other passengers. What about the law enforcement officers? During the check-in process, they must confirm that they received the required training for flying with a firearm, which hopefully you'll find reassuring. They provide their credentials and all of the official documentation that's required. Some federal agencies may allow their officers to fly with a firearm even when they're not on official business. Some flights have air marshals who are working. They have nothing to do with escorting prisoners, but by coincidence, could be on a flight where a prisoner is being transported. The pilots always know who the law enforcement officers are and where they're seated. That includes any air marshals that are working the flight. One interesting tidbit is that the armed law enforcement officers and air marshals traveling on the same flight are all made aware of each other and told of their seat locations. It's common sense, but for some reason I find that interesting. You might find it a little disconcerting to know that there are firearms and a prisoner on your flight, but for what it's worth, I've never heard of any incidents happening during the transport of a prisoner. A website called sandspotter.com published a story about a small Canadian airline that had a plane crash in 1989. Tragically, 24 of the 69 people on board were killed. The story claims that among the survivors was a constable transporting a passenger, and that he was able to maintain control of the prisoner despite being injured. Unfortunately, the website doesn't provide any source information. I didn't find anything online about a prisoner or law enforcement being passengers on the flight that crashed, so I have no idea if that's a true story. But I did promise to share a story of something that I experienced, which is 100% true to the best of my recollection. This was back in the early 1990s, and I was working at the airport ticket counter. From what I remember, it was a weekday and not too busy. A man and a woman approached my position, and we greeted each other. The man reached over the counter and plopped down a stack of passports right next to my computer keyboard. He said, "There's 10 of us. We need to check in." I craned my neck to see behind him and said, "Okay, where's the other passengers? I need to match the passports with the people." "We're not doing that," he replied. "I'm checking everyone in. This has all been cleared in advance. Go back and confirm with your manager. If he's not available, then call the director of the airport." That last part established some credibility with me because he said it with confidence. For reference, I had only seen the airport director in person a handful of times in 5 years, so that's why the confidence impressed me. I went into the offices behind the ticket counter, and my manager's immediate response was, "Yes, it's all been cleared. Do whatever he tells you." All right. I walked back out and began checking everyone in. I made small talk as I processed everything. The woman presented her credentials and was with the Department of Defense. He was with the DEA. This was all very unusual. We'd been at this for several minutes, and finally I asked if it was okay to talk about the elephant in the room. He smirked at my question. His face was exactly what you'd imagine a DEA tough guy to look like. He was probably about 6'4" and had a shaved head. At this point in the story, I need to emphasize that this was before cell phones. The following conversation wouldn't happen today. He said, "We're transporting an important witness in a case against a Colombian drug cartel. He's the only one left. The cartel has killed all of the other witnesses. We have to make sure that he arrives safely." I looked up at the woman. She had looked a little uneasy before. Now she clearly appeared to be nervous. "First time doing this?" I asked. She laughed and said yes. The DEA guy had warmed up to me and started talking. "If you look at the seat assignments," he said, "you'll see that we're all strategically positioned around him." Okay. "And we won't be at the departure gate," he continued. "We'll be driving onto the airport property through an auxiliary entrance. Once all the passengers are on board and seated, Our caravan is going to pull up alongside the plane. We're going to use the stairs on the jet bridge and go straight into the plane. Just then, it occurred to me that the cartel could have someone watching us do the check-in process. I felt a little antsy. We chatted a little bit more, and I quickly wrapped things up and they were on their way. I wanted to get a look at this operation, so I broke away from the ticket counter and went to a spot where I could see the ramp area next to the departure gate. I ran across one of my baggage handler buddies and told him to join me and explain what we were about to see. Normal Chatter was squawking on his walkie-talkie as we looked out onto the ramp. Back in those days, airlines used to transport mail for the U.S. Post Office. A Southwest Airlines ramper was driving by with 2 carts full of mail when a box tumbled out and landed about 50 yards from the back of the plane. Instantly, a voice boomed through my coworker's walkie-talkie. "Get that box out of there! Get that box out of there now!" Evidently, the DEA had one of our walkie-talkies. A ramper that was working the flight zipped out and picked the box up. I couldn't help but laugh at the timing. About 30 seconds later, 4 SUVs whizzed up to the bottom of the jetway. The doors popped open and 10 people quickly ran up the stairs. A few seconds later, the jetway was pulled from the plane pushed back, and departed without incident. Unfortunately, this was also pre-internet. The internet, of course, existed, but wasn't mainstream yet. So sadly, I don't know how the story ended for the witness or the team escorting him. I have so many questions that will never get answered. Hopefully, justice was carried out, and the escorts returned home safely. I hope you enjoyed this diversion. Thanks for listening.